The Mayor of City Home from the Good evening, and thank you very much, everyone, particularly to a very large public gallery this evening. I'd like to call on the Venerable Helen Phillips from St Thomas Anglican Church in Howrah to open our proceedings with prayer.
Thank you. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we ask that you bless this meeting tonight and all those who sit around the table of the Clarence Council as they lead and govern our community. We thank you for the many developments across our community. Bless all who work on these projects, the minds that plan and the hands that create, shape and build. Keep our community workers safe as they go about their work for our benefit. We pray, Lord, that you'll give wisdom, discernment and common sense to those who have responsibility in both decision-making and in the delivery of Council's decisions. We ask that you continue to raise up strong leaders in this Council and across our state who will serve all members of our community with justice, kindness and integrity. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks.
I'd like to acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal community as the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on tonight and pay respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to advise the meeting that it is being audio-visually recorded and proceedings will be available on the Council website later this week. Thank you. Declare the meeting open and note that there are no apologies. Item 2, confirmation of minutes for the 4th of September as circulated be taken as read and confirmed. Alderman Pearce, seconded. Alderman Chong. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. There's nothing to report. Item 3. Item 4 is that Council notes the workshops conducted on the 11th and 18th of September and the agenda brief on the 22nd of September. Thank you, Alderman Bonberto. Second, Alderman Cusick. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Item 5, declarations of interest of Alderman or close associate. There being none. Item 6, tabling of petitions. General Manager.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I do have a petition this evening from containing 202 signatories opposing DA 2016/517 at 1 Cremorne Avenue, Cremorne. I table that, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Alderman James.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I have a petition to the Mayor and Alderman of the City of Clarence where the undersigned residents of Clarence table a copy of the attached petition addressed to the members of the House of Assembly for Clarence Council information and attention.
Are there any other petitions from the floor?
Perhaps I can just say in relation to this. Thanks very much. It's very important we mention this has been tabled with the Speaker and members of the House of Assembly. The petition of the undersigned citizens of Tasmania draws the attention of the House that the Hodgman Liberal government is transferring Bellreef community land to the Chinese petrochemical company to build an enormous building on Cambridge Road.
Thank you, Alderman James. Are there any other petitions from the floor? Item 7, public question time. There are no matters on notice. Are there any questions from members of the public without notice? Yes. If you could come forward to the microphone, please, and state your name and address to introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Brian Bennett. I live at... name is Brian Bennett. I live at 44 Frederick Henry Parade, Cremorne. My question without notice is as follows. When and how can residents from 7 Mile Beach through to Opossum Bay effectively influence a more appropriate zoning for these coastal settlements in this part of Clarence?
Thank you for the question. General Manager.
Through Mr Mayor, I'd be happy to entertain some further dialogue with the gentleman that's asked the question at another subsequent time, but essentially, fundamentally, I think the first step is that he perhaps write to me outlining what I think an appropriate zoning is, and we'll seek to engage in some dialogue with the gentleman and other representatives as to what their views are, and have council consider the matter.
You're happy with that response? Thank you. There was another question over here somewhere? Yes.
At the last council meeting, I asked a question and to date have not received a reply, but that's not my question. But I just want to remind those that took it on notice that it would be nice to receive a reply. My question is, it is excellent to see council's community consultation advertised recently in the local free Eastern Shore Sun on council amalgamation, the 7 Mile Beach Sporting Precinct Master's Plan, and the Waverley Flora Park entrance. However, why wasn't the proposed public pier in Kangaroo Bay consultation tomorrow night at the Yacht Club advertised, given its impact and cost of $1.65 million of ratepayers' funds? Should more community meetings be planned?
Well, I think, first of all, there's no DA lodged yet. This is the first step and we'll be presenting it. I might add that it has been previously advertised and public consultation undertaken, and this is the second round of public consultation and discussion that's underway at the moment.
I believe that was April.
Exactly. Well, the breakwater that was previously advertised served also as a public pier. The difference this time is that there's no ferry terminal associated with the revised advertising.
Reduced scale.
So it's a reduced scale. But anyway, all will be revealed tomorrow night at the public briefing. Were there any other? Yes.
Given council is currently in discussions regarding a ferry transport system on the Derwent River, isn't it presumptive for the council to be discussing a public pier for $1.65 million for Kangaroo Bay before finalisation of those talks?
I think, first of all, the proposed pier design that will be briefed to the public tomorrow night does not include a ferry terminal, and so there's no assumption there in relation to the ferry services. I might add that the wharf at Bell Reeve has been repaired by Federal Hotels. It is now serviceable and will continue to be available as a ferry terminal. Any other questions? Thank you. Item 8 is deputations by members of the public. I'd just remind speakers that under meeting rules we're only able to afford 3 minutes per speaker, and there'll be a tone at 2.5 minutes to give you an opportunity to wind up. General Manager.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Mr Mayor, we have quite a number of speakers this evening in respect of a matter at 1 Cremorne Avenue, and I'll try and call them in the manner in which they've indicated they'd like to be called. First speaker is Chris Fox, I think. Just bear with me a second. Of Cremorne Avenue, who wishes to address council in respect of the proposed DA at 1 Cremorne Avenue. If you can come forward to this microphone, please, if possible. Yeah, that's right, sorry. Yeah, I think I'm going to have to raise it up a bit.
I would ask, while coming forward, that members of the audience please don't engage. You might be very pleased with what the speaker says or very upset about what the speaker says, but please don't either break into applause or interrupt the proceedings. It's very important that this council is able to afford procedural fairness to all speakers and all ideas in this chamber. So if you could respect that, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm actually very nervous, which is probably strange for me because I do a lot of public speaking in my day job, but I think I'm very nervous because of how I feel about the matter at hand tonight. So as I said, my name's Chris Fox and my partner and I live at 83 Cremorne Avenue, Cremorne. For those of you that are familiar with Cremorne, you'd know that's probably 1 kilometre away or thereabouts from the proposed development. So in terms of direct impact on our residents, there'll be no overshadowing, there'll be no invasion of our privacy. So I'm not here to speak on those things tonight, and I know that one of the immediate neighbours is here to speak tonight, and I am aware that there are quite a number of representations, over 120 I think, which have probably raised all of those concerns. Rather, I'm here to speak tonight about the impact of this proposed development on the broader village itself. For those of you that are familiar with the 2011 census, you'd be aware that all of the residences in Cremorne are standalone residences. There are no conjoined houses, terrace houses or rows of houses. There are no units, no flats and no apartments. Most of the houses stand well back from the road, have quite established gardens, and a whole number of those gardens blend into the verge which the residents maintain. On top of that, Cremorne's a very special place in terms of its on-pipe clay lagoon. There are coastal views, there is lots of wildlife, there's no footpaths. All in all, it's a very special place and somewhere we feel which must be protected. And whether you're walking your dog, cycling with your grandchildren and your children, in the garden, escaping from the hustle and bustle of the city, escaping from the stresses of your job. It's a place where you want to bring your children up, where you want to bring your grandchildren up, and where you want to grow old. And if the councillors that aren't familiar with Cremorne think I'm exaggerating, please, I do ask you, and I think as ratepayers it's a reasonable request, just to take one drive down and to park in the park itself, or to drive to the beachfront and just walk 1 block. And I think that's all it'll take, is one walk, and you will sense what I'm talking about tonight. So, and I think you'll also share the dismay that I found when I was made aware of this proposed development for number 1 Cremorne Avenue. On a tiny, or a relatively tiny, 605 square metre block, a 10.2 metre concrete block, monolith that'll tower over everyone and significantly and negatively visually impact not just on the houses that are adjoining, but on the whole neighbourhood. And as I said, no, I don't live close to this proposed development, but I do on most nights, like most people in the town and a whole number of visitors. I go on walks, I go on bike rides, I take my dog, and the enjoyment I and multiple others will get from that simple exercise or living in the village itself is significantly impacted by this development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fox. Time's up.
Thank you.
Next speaker, Mr Mayor, is Rachel Viney, also of Cremorne, who wishes also to address Council in respect of this matter.
Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share my concerns with you tonight. My name is Rachel Viney. I live at 48 Cremorne Avenue. I'm a teacher, a mum, and until recently I coordinated the local Coast Care group. I've lived in Cremorne for 11 years, which makes me a relative newbie by Cremorne standards. Chris has already shared with you his concerns regarding the impact of this development on the broader Cremorne community. And Cremorne is a community in the truest sense of the word. We share childminding and we look after our elderly and sick. A 20-minute walk can end up taking an hour by the time we stop and talk to everybody along the way. This is where I believe the true value of Cremorne lies, not in 4-storey multi-dwelling buildings. You could say, well, this type of development is happening everywhere, but Cremorne is not on the fringe of an area with multi-storey multi-dwelling buildings. In fact, it is surrounded by other villages and rural zoned areas. You have to drive nearly 20 minutes closer to the city before you find anything similar. From 1 to 2 storey single residence to this multi-residence development is not a small jump. It's a gigantic leap across a deep canyon from which there's no return. I'm concerned that the number of occupants has been calculated at 19 to determine the required wastewater load. I believe the way the council would calculate it would actually result in 23 occupants for a development of this size. I think this variation in number of occupants and the potential impact on the wastewater load needs further investigation. I'm concerned about the use of 120 litres of water usage per day per person. This is a 47% decrease in water usage in comparison with the Bureau of Statistics' 208 litres per person. That's potentially hundreds of thousands of litres of extra water per year. Is the wastewater system able to handle this extra water? I'm concerned there's no indication on the plans for where potential high-intensity rain overflow would go. There's no capacity to store it and no capacity to send it to land area to dissipate. I'm concerned about the management of wastewater, the potential impact of smells, pollution of groundwater, neighbour assets and council assets. If the calculations are too conservative or wrong, this would result in overloading the system. I'm concerned there's no backup location as is required by the Australian and New Zealand standards. What happens if the system doesn't work or is overloaded by greater than the expected usage? On page 7 of the Council's Health and Wellbeing Plan regarding local government, it states, a key role of local government is to manage local growth in a coordinated, planned way that reflects the community's shared vision for the future. Clearly, given the 126 submissions, as well as 202 signatures on the petition, the community agrees that this is not the type of development we want now or in the future. Yes, Cremorne has had an increase in development over the last 10 years. And no, I don't necessarily like the look or size of a number of them. However, they are single residents, not multi-dwellings. They have 1 or 2 stories, not 4. It is the concept of this type of building, as well as the mass bulk and visual impact of this development I oppose.
Thank you.
And I do not believe that's where the value of Cremorne lies.
Thank you, Ms. White.
Next speaker, Mr Mayor, is Cassandra Jacobs, also of Cremorne, again in respect of the same matter.
Thank you. Mate, please. Good evening, Mayor, councillors, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Cassandra Gregg and I am a resident of Cremorne. Whilst I live in Cremorne, the proposed development does not impact on the property I live in directly. I've had the opportunity, and I see you councillors have also had the opportunity to read the report of Ross Lovell, a comprehensive report, which was received on the 21st of September. There are 3 matters in which I wish to address you on tonight. The first is the proposed development in the context of it occurring in Cremorne. The second is the prior use of the site and the reference to that use as a benchmark. And 3, the EPA response to the contaminated site. The planner makes reference in his report to the prevailing character, the contextual characteristics of the area and what is reasonably expected in Cremorne in the report. The planner, in concluding the proposal, is non-compliant on a number of bases, of which 16.4.1, performance criteria 1 and 2, in my submission has accurately assessed that the proposed development is at odds with the prevailing character, the contextual characteristics of Cremorne, and would not be reasonably expected in Cremorne. You've heard from Chris and Rachel as to the characteristics of Cremorne, and I won't repeat those. However, it is a coastal community. There is no sewage connection, there's no town water. It has access to groundwater to assist with water and gardens. There are hardly any concrete footpaths. I think there's 2 short lengths. The next suburb closer to the city, Lauderdale, does not have any developments of this similar characteristic. And in terms of what is reasonably expected from a visual perspective, such a development in my submission would be in stark contrast to what is reasonably expected in this suburb. You've heard as to the number of 202 signatures in opposition to the proposed development. 54% of those are residents within Cremorne, 81% is the municipality of Clarence. I understand that 126 submissions were made in relation to the proposed development, and I would wager, if I was a betting person, that the majority of those were in opposition to the development. The quantum of the submissions alone clearly shows that a development is not expected or accepted. And in my respectful submission, the responses are not an emotive or self-interest driven responses, but show clearly what is and what is not reasonably expected in the area, and therefore precisely marry up with the assessment in the performance criteria that's required. The second point that I want to address you on is the benchmark used. The planner, in my respectful submission, says that it was most recently used for a shop and takeaway shop and service station. This is the site of the development that's proposed. There are two issues in accepting that statement on its face as the benchmark. It was not used as a shop and takeaway since 2011, and it has been since 2007. It was used as a petrol station. The shop that it was used for was a small post office to get bread and milk and some takeaways on occasion. It serviced only the Cremorne residents. It didn't increase traffic into the area, and mostly people attended there on foot. And therefore, to use that as a benchmark without it being defined as the type of shop that it was in my submission is inaccurate. Thank you.
Next speaker, Mr Mayor, is Mark Hand, also of Cremorne, who wishes to address Council in respect of this matter.
I'm not very sure. I should do it for a living. Much more comfortable with that than I'm talking into it. Good evening, everyone. I'm here today to ask this council to refuse the development application for 1 Cremorne Avenue. An unprecedented overdevelopment is completely out of character of the area. When we first moved to Cremorne, we bought a vertical wood house. There's quite a few of them in Cremorne, often built by a group of mates over a summer. Cremorne is what the planners identify as low-density coastal development, consisting almost exclusively of 1 or 2 storey single dwellings. We'd barely finished unpacking when our new neighbour popped over. "You will be keeping the vertical boards, won't you?" she asked. You can call that many things. I call it a clear indication of how the residents view and value the character of the area. Excuse me. I moved 5 years ago from number 30 to 3. I already knew my new neighbour. We'd been dog walking acquaintances for years. Mick at number 5 lives in a vertical board house. He mows the lawn for number 7, who live in town. In summer, we exchange fish and vegetables over the fence, something you may call community or perhaps amenity. The kind of amenity that gets lost when wooden fences are replaced with concrete walls. The bulk of this 26.6 metre long, 9.5 metre high concrete monolith will literally block the early morning summer sun from my backyard, and Mick's, and Andrew's at number 9, and his in-laws at number 11. The planner's report makes it clear that this building does not comply with the planning requirements for height, setback from boundaries, and setback from the street frontage. Since I've been in Cremorne, some of the original houses have grown up and out to accommodate growing families. Some have been replaced with contemporary houses that sit comfortably within the built environment, but Cremorne remains low-density coastal development, almost exclusively 1 or 2 storey single dwellings. An unprecedented development which has received an extraordinary response with 126 submissions, I suspect mostly from people like me, who fear that if this application succeeds, the villages of the southern beaches will be changed forever. To be honest, I'd rather not be here tonight. I'd rather be surfing or fishing or walking on the beach I love with my family. But the idea of Cremorne Beach being overshadowed by a 9.5 metre concrete apartment block stacked side by side compels me to do everything I can, not only to protect my village, but the similarly zoned beachside suburbs of Clarence. I ask that you do the same.
Next speaker, Mr Mayor, is Nathan Hodge, who wishes to address Council in relation to proposed development at 14 Parsonage Place, Rugby.
Unfortunately, normally there'd be an opportunity to reply, but applications for that had actually to be in by Friday, and we received no application.
I was told that I could speak for 3 minutes.
Well, I did, as I said earlier, I think procedural fairness is very important, and I think we could...
I would move that we...
If Alderman McFarlane so moved.
I would move that.
So do we have a seconder for that procedural motion? Thank you, Alderman Thurley. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Fine. Please come forward. I'll remind you that there are only 3 minutes available.
We want to just I won't take my money in a few minutes. I'm looking at the gentleman.
How did you hear? That makes sense, yeah.
Hello, my name's Nathan Hodge. I'm the resident and owner of the dwelling at 14's Parsonage Place. Recently I've put a outdwelling on my property and had some complaints about the height and where it's situated. I have some pictures to prove that the complaints aren't valid. I'd like to pass them out, but I don't know who to give them to, sorry. When I spoke to the gentleman, the complaints were that there was not enough sunlight prior to 9 o'clock. If you look at the pictures, they are in sequence. One of, I think it is the 9:45 one, is when sun actually does come through, because there is not enough sun because there is a hill behind our house. And that's it. That's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. Open your remarks with name and address as well, please.
Solid, 1 Cremorne Avenue, Cremorne. I've heard the speakers speak on the matter, but unfortunately I wish to raise that not once have I been able to present a presentation to the community, even though I've offered. No one has spoken to me about this proposal, yet again we have all these objections raised on information without every statement. So therefore the information you get back from the plebiscite is reacting to false information, and therefore the petitions that you get are solicited signatures, so no weight can be given to those at all. Yes. Now, further, all those discussions about, etc., walking the dog, the buildings can't affect walking the dog, it can't affect the beach, it can't affect the view, it can't affect the water. Now, more to the point, it is site-specific. It comes off the boundaries that are known. They are zero boundaries. Concrete Rock Mark says that there is already a concrete wall of some 3 metres high at the back plugging through. And I've given you photographs of the wall adjoining my neighbour. Unfortunately, the planner has left out the submissions I made raising the detriment and the problems that I find that Mr. Markham faces with his property. One, he built veggie gardens that up over my septic trenches illegally. His swimming pool arguably is not 1.5 metres from the boundary easement.
Could you speak to the chair, please?
And his eaves are 40 centimetres from the boundary, not 150. He has built structures on the property, and there's an envirocycle there. With all that mass in the backyard, it is impossible to have sufficient air to run the envirocycle. With the development that goes up, the wall actually comes down to 2.1 metres, goes back in 1.5 metres, goes up to 1.7, down from 8 back in. So you have a hearing effect. It is impossible to see the penthouse looking from down along. There are no issues with privacy, no issues with overshadowing, no issues for lack of sunshine. The reports clearly show, the experts show, and this is very important, the design is clever because it gives more sunshine in my neighbour's backyard and front yard than it does now. All the objections raised have been shown to be irrelevant. What we have now is the planner, in my view, has not put those problems forward in fairness. I have written them out themselves, and furthermore, she has omitted a plan put which takes a Google map of my client's property. Why she omitted it, I don't know. But that will show the swimming pool, the easement and the problems, and the veggie garden over the tank. It is something that needs to take into account. In my opinion, my neighbour will gather the benefit of all that because the easement will be extinguished and all problems are cured. If they're not, he's got problems and expense going forward. In relation to the planners' view of chalk and cheese, and this is
You need to start winding up.
on Frederick Henry Esplanade, it's important because those blocks run east-west. Block I'm on runs north-south. If you adopted the planner's view, and I'd given you a copy of on the bank there, it would be impossible to build on number 1 if you accept that planner's comment of the streetscape.
Thank you.
While we have an existing building, we're working from that.
Thank you.
No more speakers, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Item 9, there are no items. Item 10, reports from outside bodies. 10.1, single and joint authorities. Southern Tasmanian Council's authority. There was a board meeting today. The minutes will be circulated in time for the next meeting. Copying refuse disposal site to an authority. Warren Campbell.
The last meeting's minutes should be circulated.
And Tasmanian Water Corporation, the government's proposal to take over Taswater is proceeding, and the LegCo proceeding in Parliament, and the Legislative Council is undertaking hearings, and in fact I presented on behalf of LCAT on Friday. Taswater is again before them this coming Friday, so we expect the report towards the end of October from the Legislative Council. Item 10.2, reports from Council and special committees and other representative bodies. Are there any reports? Alderman McFarlane.
Minutes of the Cycling South meeting for May and August.
Thank you.
Here I have the minutes of the Business East Board of Management meeting from July.
Thank you. Other reports. Moving on to item 11.1, that the weekly briefing reports of the 4th, 11th and 18th of September be noted. Thank you, Alderman Turley. Alderman Pears. Alderman James.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I refer to the 4th of September and to item 29, the proposed aged care facility at Worksworth in Belrive. There is a proposal from the State Government, Mr Mayor, for the aged care facility, which will be owned by the State Government and operated by Winteringham, which is a Victorian-based not-for-profit organisation. My question through you to Mr Lovell, in his capacity as City Planner, to use the old terminology, Manager of City Planning. Mr Lovell, Council's role in this application, given that there may be some concerns about contamination of the site and also from past activities, namely quarrying and storing of some hazardous waste, does Council have any authority to actually send in our officers to examine and also seek from the State Government a report as to the siting or to the actual building of this particular development as part of the development application process?
Lovell?
Can I perhaps answer that one, and Ross, you might correct me. They're matters that have been, I think, raised during the current public consultation process that I'll call them the Department of Health and Human Services are going through. Matters that relate specifically to potential contamination of the site and or the form of quarrying, we can raise with them and ask them to address as part of any application that comes forward.
Any other questions from the weekly briefing reports? I'll put the motion that the info be noted. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. 11.2, there are no petitions tabled at the previous council meeting to deal with. I'd like to advise that Council now sits as a planning authority under the Land Use Planning and Approvals Act. Alderman von Berto.
Mayor, I'd like to move a procedural motion
that item 11.3.6, the development application C 2016-517 at 1 Cremorne Avenue for 5 multiple dwellings is actually moved to the beginning of the planning item.
Thank you, Alderman Pearce. It being a procedural matter, there's no opportunity to debate that. So the motion is that we deal with the 11.3.6 first. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. So item 11.3.6 is a development application for 1 Cremorne Avenue, 5 multiple dwellings. Yes. You're moving the recommendation, madam?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Standing up on my feet and moving the recommendation.
Moving the recommendation. Thank you. Seconded, Alderman Cusick. Alderman Jones, would you like to speak to the motion?
Look, Mr Mayor, I don't want to go into chapter and verse in relation to this, but I think that in a nutshell, the building is of a bulk, scale and size that is not in keeping with the amenity of the area, that it's also incompatible with other buildings in the immediate vicinity, and it will impact upon the lifestyle and also the way of life that residents in Cremorne, in a coastal village, have been accustomed to, and also the performance criteria, which is part of the process to drill into matters that pertain to the acceptable solutions as part of the Clarence interim planning scheme, have been addressed by the actual manager of city planning. There has been a lot of debate. There have been many representations, Mr Mayor. I think that the officer's recommendation encapsulates the key matters that pertain to the matter in relation to 1 Cremorne, and it could have ramifications in relation to other coastal villages within Clarence, and it's already been referred to earlier this evening as regards to 7 Mile Beach, even from perspective of South Arm and Possum Bay. They are all part of a village scenario. They have the benefit of a in-keeping amenity, and notwithstanding there may be 1 or 2 other developments on the Cremorne spit that may be brought as part of the discussion process, it still does not detract from the fact that the greater part of Cremorne in that village context is in fact the way that this particular matter has gone, and I seek council support to support the officer's recommendation and refuse the application in accordance with the officer's recommendation.
Alderman Cusick, as second of the motion.
There has been, as has been pointed out by a number of the speakers and the council officers, this development is not compatible with the other buildings, setbacks, bulk, visual impact, the intensity of the project. And in the office pointed out that the proposed building would be set back 1.3 million metres from the street frontage, significantly less than adjacent properties. It is considered that the combination of bulk, height and reduced setbacks results in proposal incompatible with the contextual characteristics of the area. This building, furthermore, the prevailing characteristic of the Cremorne area is low density coastal development consisting almost exclusively of single or two-storey buildings, and although the officers have accepted the wastewater plan as submitted, it does say the land application area is less than that required in table 23.1, which says a new dwelling must be provided with land application area that complies with that table. I support council. I ask council support of this.
Other speakers. Alderman Thurley.
Mr Mayor, I know at our agenda briefing luncheon I questioned the criteria for refusing this proposal and indicated that I hadn't really seen that necessarily used before, but it was pointed out to me, and it's so crucial to this decision that it's a village zone. And the basis for refusal is to do with its bulk and size and insufficient setback on a particular boundary. I personally like the look of the building. I quite find that it's neatened up that corner. It's actually made it quite consistent with some of the wonderful developments that are on the foreshore there. But the reality is that this is not the type of amenity that is actually required in Cremorne to actually suit the lifestyle that people enjoy. And the reasons that are given in the report are quite valid in the sense that the bulk and size will change the amenity of the whole area. I'm therefore inclined to consider this proposal and support Council's decision. I often find it hard to comprehend why developers try and push boundaries so much when the planning scheme has guidelines and has we have to exercise discretion, but the pressure comes on us when we are trying to support development, but we also have proposals before us that we just can't support.
Okay, other speakers? Alderman McFarlane.
I too support the refusal by the staff. However, I do take on board more so some of the comments by the representatives which were not mentioned in the report, and they were spoken about tonight by Rachel Viney in regards to the wastewater treatment for this particular application. But my concerns are also for a broader and bigger picture, and that is the long-term viability of an area that has an inundation, I'm going to call it overlay. The day that I went to the meeting at the reserve, I drove down what I've been told is Perfect Henry's Parade, and it had water pooling which was not moving, and I couldn't remember there being a really heavy downfall, but that water was deep, probably because of the potholes. However, it was indicative of the fact that the water doesn't move. I feel that as a council we need to investigate climate change possibilities for our village areas, and particularly areas like 7 Mile Beach, which we've done in the past, in relation to the water tables and the future needs of those areas to remain viable. I appreciate the fact that the local residents have formed a group, and also would urge them to continue to look at the needs for the area in doing their own research on those issues which will affect them in the future, because this planning scheme has been changed by a state government which we as a council have no ability to resolve. So we need to advise the community to look to their own means to ameliorate certain conditions, and some of those are future climate change possibilities. This area, again, as other members have spoken about, has a village sense of place, which we in Tasmania are privileged to remain in our keeping for future generations.
Alderman McFarlane. Any other speakers? Alderman Hume.
Very good report on this one. As I've said before on other development applications, and another one that was particularly controversial, these performance criteria in relation to bulk, scale, massing, those sort of issues. I don't envy the task of our planning staff, because it's difficult to interpret those objectively. They are fairly vague terms. And we don't have an interpretation of them by the tribunal. I suspect that at some point in the future we will get one because of the subjectivity of these terms. And I have said in relation to certain other applications that in terms of whether it could fall one way or the other on those performance criteria, you could just about flip a coin, because the buildings are so close to the building envelope. I don't believe that this is one of those proposals. I believe that this one is actually quite clear cut, when you consider the village zone and what's the character of the area, and the bulk and scale of this development in relation to what is typically seen in the village zone. It is unfortunate with the new statewide planning scheme that we're not going to really see an equivalent of the village zone continuing, and it would be something that would be nice to have continue, given the number of areas that we have throughout Clarence that are part of that zone. But look, even if you don't accept the argument in relation to those performance criteria, the one in terms of the setback and the compatibility with the setbacks in the area, I think is also pretty clear cut. So I also support the officer's recommendation.
Alderman Pearce.
Thank you. Yeah, I do support the officer's recommendation, and I must say I congratulate the people that did put in submissions, because in my time on council, I think they were probably one of the best group of representations I've seen, because I wasn't duplicated. Everybody had their own thoughts. Everybody had something different, which I do appreciate. When I went down to have a look at the site, I did meet with the applicant, and the applicant spoke to me and spoke quite well, because he has got a vision for that corner. That doesn't necessarily, I agree with his vision, but I understand what he's trying to do. So hopefully, if he comes back with another application, that he can talk to the neighbours and work something out, because I can see what he is trying to do on that corner. Because of what, and I'm not going through what everybody else said, because I agree with the bulk, I agree with the height. It's not really in keeping with that area. So in that sense, I do have to support the officer's recommendation for recusal.
Other speakers? Alderman Walker.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This has been quite an involved matter, quite an involved process. There have been lots of representations, and as has been mentioned earlier, they tend to all be unique in the nature of what they're stating. There is a fair bit to commend about the design. There really is. But the simple fact of the matter is, I could think of many places in Clarence where this would be totally appropriate, but Cremorne isn't one of them. We talk about the village zone. We don't have a unique village, but in many ways Cremorne is unique. I can't think of another area, certainly in Clarence, but through Tasmania, that matches up, especially in proximity to the city as it is. It feels so much further away. When you sit as a planning authority, the criteria you have to assess matters is incredibly narrow. Lots of components that people have said tonight, and they really feel from their heart, are things that we aren't able to take into account when we assess things as a planning authority. One of the things too around the planning authority, compared to other council matters and general commercial matters, is the matters of risk. We are so prescribed around what the planning authorities let us talk about, that other risks that might normally come into things, about what might happen if calculations are wrong, perhaps around stormwater as one example, aren't something that we can take into account. So I look at this, and as I said, for the site, for the area, as the officers have noted, it's a pretty comfortable case of not being appropriate. The setbacks aren't adequate given the scale, and I won't be supporting it.
Other speakers? Alderman Chong.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. As a irregular but reasonably frequent visitor to Cremorne, I can entirely empathise with the community spirit that people have talked about. However, as Alderman Walker says, that's not something that we can put into a decision for a planning scheme. Also, like Alderman Pearce, I was very impressed with the depth of information that we got in the representations. Many times representations consider a number of issues, but often ones that we can't consider as a planning authority. But these typically brought up a lot of very detailed planning items and referenced planning schemes, and it made it a lot easier to consider in what is really quite a complex matter. So based on the information from the planners, I will be supporting the officer's recommendation tonight.
Alderman von Berto?
Mr Mayor, I agree with a number of the aldermen in relation to the depth of the representation. Tonight has been an example of the clarity and the passion with which members of the community
Through the chair, please, Alderman von
have
Berto.
actually considered the issues at hand. I believe that Mr Bennett's question tonight is key to this particular issue in relation to looking at the zone and the standards within the zone, and that actually needs to be considered in more detail into the future. Because the officers have made it very clear that this is not about the community per se, it is about a particular development and the merits of that development in relation to the standards that need to be applied. And so they have looked at it, and I think page 133, few words there, actually are the nutshell of it. It says it is considered that the proposed development would not be reasonably expected in this residential area, especially in such close proximity. That's to number 3, Cremorne Avenue. Based on these concerns, it is considered the proposal would constitute a significant loss of the residential amenity of the adjoining property owner. The proposal is recommended for review on this basis. So it's very specific in relation to a particular adjoining property. So I think that's really important that we actually note that. Whereas with a lot of the representation, there is this idea of what the community actually believes should occur right across the area. That may not necessarily be the case if another application was actually put forward in another area of the community. However, a lot of the reasoning of the community is very justified. So I will be supporting the officer's recommendation based on the very clear parameters that we have within the planning scheme, which Alderman Walker has actually expressed. Thank you.
Right, a reply, Alderman Jones.
Comments that have been made have covered the whole issue in relation to this development. But I would like to say in conclusion that this has been a community involvement from day one. There have been key people that have felt very strongly about this proposal and have taken the steps of not only approaching the elected representatives, but also trying to get some feedback from a one-on-one sort of gathering which occurred at Cremorne some weeks ago. And that, I think, was not only the catalyst to sort of speak out to the rest of the community and say that representations have to close by the 6th of September 2017. And also there was discussion about a steering committee or a community working group to sort of get involved and also initiate a petition. So the groundwork was done right back before it actually got to council, because we became involved sooner rather than later, and that meant that we would be able to be briefed and know the concerns of the people in that area, and even beyond, because there were some other representations from 7 Mile Beach, etc. So this has been a community activity which has identified certain aspects of the Clarence Interim Planning Scheme, the standards that relate to that, and then the performance criteria that is actually based on as to whether or not a proposal should be approved or otherwise. And those performance criteria have been addressed in the officer's recommendation. So what the residents have raised or put forward to us, and obviously put in a number of representations which I can't recall other than when this council back in '86 wanted to have universal water metering. And that in fact had a huge ramification on the city, and we had meetings, etc. But nevertheless,
Please,
yep, I know, I'm coming to that. The officers' recommendation have summed it to the T, and the officers, with assistance from the community, have addressed the performance criteria, and we have a motion that has been moved and seconded and discussed, and I believe it really takes on board the community's concerns, and I hope the council supports the officer's recommendation.
So the motion before the chair is the officer's recommendation for refusal. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you. The next item is resuming our normal agenda, 11.3.1, which is a development application at 14 Algona Street, South Arm for a dwelling. Alderman Thurley, are you moving that?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder, please? Alderman Pearce. Alderman Thurley, would you like to speak to the motion, please?
Mr Mayor.
Might just wait for a moment to let things quieten down. Thank you. If the meeting could come to order, please. Alderman Thurley.
Mr Mayor, this application...
Just a moment, we're showing. Thank you.
This application has been recommended for approval based on the conditions therein listed in the report, and those conditions can be met. The proponent has actually been liaising with council, and according to the conditions, the proposal and the way it's met the performance criteria on page 19 has been addressed to the satisfaction of the applicant. There doesn't seem to be any other issues. This is a case of actually adhering to any discretions that we need to address in this proposal. I support recommendation.
Alderman Pearce.
Yes, look, similar with the acceptable solutions and everything else, and I think this is a good development, I really do, and I think, I can't see any reason why we'd oppose it.
Alderman Jones.
Yes, look, there are a number of reasons why, in fact, council should consider this very carefully, and before I go into it, Mr Mayor, I would like to pose a question through you to Mr Lovell. It's up here again. Thanks, Mr Lovell. A lot has been covered in the coastal vulnerability assessment prepared by GES, and that really seems to be the foundation, and I'm referring to page 22 of the report, when it goes through the risk of users of the site adjoining on nearby land is acceptable. But, Mr. Lovell, why wasn't that report enclosed as part of the attachment? Question that I have in relation to this, and I've just asked it of the manager of city planning, is that most of the performance criteria within this particular application is based on the coastal vulnerability assessment prepared by GS, and that in part talks about or refers to that has been accepted and recommendations are accepted by the council's engineer, in that the risk to users of the site and adjoining and nearby land is considered acceptable. And all through these items of performance criteria, on page 23, both council's engineer and the coastal vulnerability assessment conclude that there would not be any increase to risk of life to either users of the site's neighbouring properties or public infrastructure. Now, I think because it doesn't comply in many aspects of this within the actual embodiment of the report, on page 18 it refers to setback does not comply, wall height, etc., although there is some adjustment made. Then on page 20, the building and works within a waterway and coastal protection area must be within a building area on a planned subdivision, does not comply, no building envelope on the subject site. And it goes on and on and on, and it refers to specific protection codes and assessment codes, etc. So it's, again, on coastal inundation, the medium hazard areas does not comply for a new habitable building. It says here there's no acceptable solution, but that doesn't necessitate the actual question of whether or not it is in accordance with the planning scheme. There are so many ifs and buts in relation to this, and even the location of the site. And on the draft agenda that we had circulated to us on Monday, it shows, look, right there on the dunes, and it's in a very vulnerable situation. And I think that if we had been provided with the assessment in relation, and this impinges upon the very basis of why the officers have recommended this for approval. I just have some real concerns about it. I believe we should have been provided with that assessment, and I think that if we had read the assessment, there would have been some, I think, comments that would have basically, in my view, raised some concerns about the vulnerability, the impact on the dunes, and also on the amenity of the area. And I just believe that we haven't got all the information available to us, and on that basis I will not be supporting the recommendation. Other speakers, Alderman Cusick.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, following on from Alderman James, I guess, I again would like to ask Mr. Lovell. It's a 463 square metre block. Now, this is an unsewered area, isn't it? Am I correct there? So it doesn't seem to be, that I can see, there is the references to the site of the block and the risks associated with such an area. Building and works are within a waterway and coastal protection area. There doesn't seem to be any reference in here as to the on-site wastewater system, the storage system, specifically.
Page 17.
I mean, a 463 square metre block in an uninsured area that has an on-site wastewater system would again, as my worry, would be a bit of a worry to me. But there doesn't seem to be any reference as to the on-site wastewater system.
The wastewater system will be approved by the program authorisers. There are many examples of probably smaller than this which should obtain approval, particularly say across and back. So the size of the lot is important, but so it's also sufficient in technical exploitation.
Size of the lot. Sorry.
Yeah, keep going, but it's not an opportunity to engage in a debate with Mr.
The
Lovell.
size of the lot and the location in such a waterway and coastal protection area the location would have to be taken into consideration, I presume.
Yes. Any other speakers? Alderman here.
Yeah. Mr Mayor, I understand in terms of on-site wastewater management that there is a reference to it on page 17 that it meets the acceptable solution. So that's probably why it isn't looked at in detail in the report, because generally when we receive these reports the detail is provided in relation to the performance criteria. Could ask a question to the staff, I guess, of, you know, what exactly is the acceptable solution, because usually when things meet the acceptable solution. But having said that, look, I think it's rather disingenuous for Alderman James to sort of refer to the number of acceptable solutions that aren't met, because as we all know, the number of acceptable solutions that aren't complied with doesn't matter when it comes to these assessments. The question is whether in every single one of those cases, when it comes to acceptable solution, does the development either meet the relevant performance criteria, would the performance criteria, can the performance criteria be met with an appropriate condition, or if neither of those would the performance criteria be significantly affected if the acceptable solution was met? And that's how we assess development applications. We're all well aware of how the planning scheme works. You know, when it comes to these assessments by council engineers, this is stuff that requires expertise. It's highly technical, and unless I believe we have expert opinions to the contrary of something that's been assessed by a council engineer, we are not experts, neither are we elected or appointed to this planning authority to be experts on these issues. We receive appropriate expertise. We accept that expertise unless we have expert opinion to the contrary. You know, a great example of where we did have expert opinions to the contrary and a third opinion was sought was planning application where, you know, there's the issues about swift parrot habitats or something like that. But you know, we have to accept the expert advice that's given to us, and I don't believe it helps us a lot in making these assessments if we're provided highly technical reports that we're expected to, you know, look at and try and pass expert judgment on. That's not our role.
Other speakers? Alderman Walker.
Yes, look, thank you. Just to reinforce Your Worship, what Alderman Hume said in relation to the accumulation aspect with each and every aspect that which might require a workable solution. In many ways, I think the scheme that would actually have some element around accumulation would be better than the current situation, because it perhaps doesn't paint the totality of a picture. However, read the report and I'm fairly comfortable with the officer's recommendations. And again, I'd just probably emphasise as well that during my time on council, when there is a threshold of concern raised by other aldermen that I usually am privy to or
we are all privy to a circulated alternate motion and reasons for that alternate motion as to why a refusal would be appropriate. I may well have been cut out of the loop this time. It has been known to happen, but I certainly didn't receive that. So I'm not sure there's great veracity for a refusal.
Yeah, other speakers? Alderman McFarlane?
Not being a professional of any kind when it comes to the inundation zone, but having been privy to the fact that a number of groups I was involved in wrote to Coastal Policy, and within the context of council doing its own planning scheme, supported the inundation zone, which was based on, from my memory, previous coastal protection areas. So looking at this application from a Google search, one can see that the original coastal protection zone is in place. When it then relates back to the inundation zone under the planning scheme, there's a small amount of area caused by a dip, which is even obvious on Google, that a back corner of the property has a section of it in the inundation zone, but the design of the building is designed in such a way that any kind of flooding probably won't affect the living quarters, which seem to be out of its range. I too have problems when I'm reading reports with standards and comments where it says under the approved planning scheme this site does not comply because it doesn't have a building envelope on it. And I just would like to ask the question of Mr. Lovell as to why does it not have a building envelope on it?
Through Mr. Mayor, you've actually quite a small number of properties that do have an envelope because the envelope is based on the subdivision stage. And so we're going to be quite recent subdivisions that may have an envelope if the developer chose to.
It just seems to me that we get confused when we're reading these reports. If it says it doesn't comply, it sounds as though it's some kind of legislative requirement to comply. So I think we should have a little discussion about these sorts of topics when they come up, because it then goes back over to page 21. In the inundation prone area code, for a new habitable building there is no acceptable solution. So can we follow that up at a workshop? Because I would have assumed that there would have been some kind of acceptable solution, like building 3 metres off the ground.
Alderman McFarlane, I think
Anyway,
keep on with the assessment.
I support the application in the context that it's an old subdivision area. It does incorporate a buffer zone, which was part of the original coastal buffer zones that have always been in place, and it has the capacity to manage its wastewater.
Thank you. Other speakers? Alderman von Berto.
Mayor, I note that there were actually several representations received, and one of those representations actually raised a number of issues. So stability at the frontal dune, solar access, visual impact, loss of view, inconsistency with character of the area, and objection on the basis of applicable codes. The report that has actually been provided by the applicant by GES is to actually answer the issues in relation to coastal protection and coastal issues. However, I actually feel that the aspects of overlooking and loss of privacy and bulk and massing, in my mind, have actually got weight, and so therefore I won't be supporting this application, because I actually feel that there is an issue in relation to particularly the overlooking of the property adjacent to this particular development. From the plan, it actually appears to me that this will be a dwelling that is of considerable bulk and massing.
Yes. Other speakers? Right to reply, Alderman Thurley.
Mr Mayor, it is really crucial to read this report and read all of it, and yes, you haven't had we haven't had a detailed engineering report, but we are being guided by the council in this respect, and to address Alderman Womberto's concerns about privacy, there is going to be screening to 1.7 metres above floor level to address this issue, and the applicant in good faith has also agreed to reduce the size of the windows. So I think the aspect of privacy has been well and truly addressed, and I commend the applicant for their cooperation in trying to get this application through. When we go through the report in relation to Alderman James's queries, council engineers are satisfied that the proposal would not adversely impact natural values associated with the bay, on the basis that the wastewater system has been appropriately designed to protect the significance of the lagoon and dune system within proximity of the site. Council engineers are satisfied that the natural values of the site would not be compromised in relation to erosion or sedimentation. I'll keep going because I need to read these things because they haven't been points. Both concludes the risks associated with the proposal are acceptable both for inhabitants of the site and property within the lifetime of the proposed development. Council engineers considered that the proposed construction methods referred to by the Coastal Vulnerability Assessment are an appropriate response to erosion risks, and on that basis the condition has been included above. And that also on page 17 was a reference to a on-site wastewater system, which Alderman have said doesn't really get a mention, but you have to really read the report appropriately. You actually have to rely on professional advice in this case, and this application needs supporting.
Thank you. So the motion before the Chair is for approval, subject to conditions and advice. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Item 11.3.2 is a development application at 14 Parsonage Place, Rugby, for an outbuilding, and it's a retrospective approval. Alderman Walker's moved it. Thank you. Seconded Alderman Campbell. Alderman Walker.
Yes, just quickly, it's come before us. Retrospective approvals do require extra fees associated with the applications, and they're, if you like, a mechanism to keep things running at a relatively straightforward way. Otherwise, we're looking at processes to tear down sheds, court costs associated with it, etc. I think this is fairly straightforward as it's read through by what the officers say, and it just has to be assessed within the context of a planning authority, and other matters aren't really relevant.
Alderman Campbell. Other speakers. Alderman James.
Mr Mayor, there is a history. I'm going to go into the detail. What happened is that the representative had an agreement with council to have, and also the applicant, to have the building relocated. And that was basically, it was agreed to by all the parties, and the representative waived his representation on the basis of that. And subsequent to that, it had a permit issued by council. It was stamped accordingly. What happened then was the shed was put up in the wrong location, contrary to what the agreement was between the council, assuming the applicant, and also the representative. He spent considerable amount of money seeking advice from Jackie Blowfield, and as a result of that, Jackie put in a submission to council, as well as he did opposing the actual development application we have before us tonight. And the application that's before us tonight is to approve the relocation of the building to a site that was not agreed to by the parties and which was consented to by the council.
Alderman Jones, I do need to point out that we need to deal with the application as it stands.
Yes.
While interesting background, if you could focus on the merits of the existing application, please.
This is a retrospective approval.
Sure.
That is what it's about, retrospective. In other words, it's setting in basically before this council the recommendation of approving where the building should not have been. That's basically what it's about. And as a result of that,
just to be clear, Alderman Jones,
as a result of that, Mr.
Alderman
Mayor,
Jones, if you could, just for a moment, please. The issue that we have to deal with is whether the existing site is appropriate under the planning scheme or not. Whether it was originally planned to be there or not is not relevant to this application. I need to point that out.
Okay, and I'm referring to retrospective approval. That's what we are talking about. Retrospective approval for a shed which has been built in the wrong location, subsequent to an agreement which was reached between the council, which issued a planning permit for the shed, and also between the applicant and the representative. On page 46, Mr. Mayor, and I like to quote this because it's quite interesting. Should the outbuilding be relocated in accordance with the previous planning permit, so I'm talking about the previous planning permit, which is actually in the agenda.
Yes.
It says the building would be moved 1 metre further away from the side southern west boundary and the maximum height reduced by 0.4 metres. These changes would not result in a significant change to the level of overshadowing and sunlight to inhabitable rooms and the private open space on the adjoining property. So what they're saying here is that it would not result in any overshadowing if it was relocated. So what are we talking about here? We are saying that if there is a retrospective approval given, okay, therefore there is a lesser amount of overshadowing that will be required. The point about this exercise, Mr. Mayor, is that we are issuing retrospective approval for a site when for a shed when in fact there was a permit that was issued by the parties for the shed to be relocated elsewhere, and the representative, on the best of faith and intention, decided that he would waiver his and withdraw his representation. In the next instance, the shed is put up in another location which is contrary to the permit, and now this council is going ahead and approving retrospectivity the shed which was basically in the same location which the representative objected to in the first instance.
I need to point out once again and remind this meeting that whether it's retrospective or not is irrelevant. What is relevant is the merit of the application as it stands. Alderman Hume.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, I was just going to reiterate your point. When we have a retrospective application, yes, developments should be built in accordance with their planning permits, and yes, planning approval should be sought before a building is built. However, we do allow for retrospective approval because if something is built in accordance with the planning scheme, then it doesn't make sense to just pull it down and rebuild it again. There are penalties for seeking approval after the fact rather than in advance. And those penalties are there is a higher fee for retrospective approval, and also if you seek retrospective approval then you may run the risk that after the fact it doesn't comply with the scheme and you will have to pull it down. So those are the penalties or potential penalties for seeking retrospective approval. But our scheme and planning law does allow for retrospective approval, And as you correctly pointed out, regardless of the, what transpired before that approval was sought, just as any other application, a retrospective application must be considered on its merits in accordance with the planning scheme. We're all well aware of that, and I believe Alderman James is well aware of that too.
Alderman Thurley.
Mr Mayor, I would understand that the initial planning permit was issued and altered to try and appease the representative, not based on the fact that it wasn't meeting the planning requirements, but more out of an act of good faith to assist in this process. So the fact that we are now looking at it, we have to look at it from a fresh set of eyes. This actually is about adjudicating whether it actually fits in with the planning scheme, and it could well have fitted in with the planning scheme back then where it is now, except that there was an agreement done to put it somewhere else. That agreement is no longer to be considered because we have to consider this as through fresh eyes. And the question is, does this meet the planning requirements? And yes, it does. Therefore, he has paid his dues. He's upset his neighbour and he's got to live with that for the rest of his life. But we have to adjudicate this without emotion and without history. We have to look at it with fresh eyes.
Thank you, Alderman Thurley. Other speakers? Right reply, Alderman Walker.
Thank you, Mr. This is a retrospective approval. We've talked about it. We've talked about the fact that when these things occur, there are penalties in the form of higher fees, charges, and an elevated level of risks. It's a retrospective approval, and it is done using contemporaneous actual facts with a contemporaneous application with planning schemes and standards as they are before us. The officers have done that. Their recommendation is pretty cut and dried, and it'd be a brave person to predict that this is something that, if not approved, would be confirmed at any appeal to a higher level. Seat councillors.
Thank you. So the motion is approval subject to conditions and advice. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Item 11.3.3 is a development application at 55A Bastic Rosny for 2 multiple dwellings. Thank you, Alderman Walker. Second, Alderman Cusick. Alderman Walker.
Similar planning application to a meeting not that long ago, I would state, and a reasonable application as well. Seek support.
Alderman Cusick.
Thanks, Mayor. I know there are a number of representations, but they all seem to be being adequately addressed by council officers, and I also seek council support.
Thank you. Other speakers? Alderman James.
A question on page 63 of the officer's report. It refers to, under the comments, council's engineers are satisfied that the proposal, development and driveway configurations are reasonable response. And it goes on to say that council's existing network, whilst achieving the targets established by the State Stormwater Strategy 2010, as required by this performance criteria appropriate condition, has been included above to reflect the requirement. Now, if we go to the recommendation on page 54, it refers to, under recommendation A6, para 2, it refers to, amongst other things, detailed engineering designs accompanied with a report on all the stormwater design parameters and assumptions for the MUSIC model. My question through you to Mr Lovell. Mr Lovell, on page 63, performance criteria does refer to the SSS 10, but there is no mention of that in the actual officer's recommendation.
So, sorry, what's the question? Well, I'm sorry, you made a statement, but you haven't asked the question.
Oh, I did. I thought I'd ask the question. Okay. On page 63, 63, the performance criteria refers to the Stormwater Strategy 2010 as being required by this performance criteria as an appropriate condition. Okay. In the officer's recommendation, Mr. Mayor, under 6.2, it doesn't refer to triple S10.
So?
Could I have clarification?
Sure.
That's all I need to know. Is that okay?
Yeah,
all right?
it helps to have a question.
Okay, good.
Mr. Mayor, I think your question SS10 refers to the State Stormwater Strategy 2010. That's described in the last line of the first paragraph of 6.
First paragraph of condition number 6.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Other speakers? Right reply, Alderman Walker. Motion before the Chair is for approval, subject to conditions and advice. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Item 11.3.4 is a development application at 42 King Street, Bellerive for an outbuilding. Alderman McFarlane, thank you. Seconder? Alderman Cusick, thanks. Alderman McFarlane?
Support the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Alderman Cusick. Other speakers? I guess there's no need for a right of reply. So the motion is officer's recommendation for condition approval, subject to conditions and advice. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Item 11.3.5 is a development application at 9 Park Street, Bellerive for multiple dwellings. Moved Alderman Hume. Seconded Alderman McFarlane, thank you. Alderman here. Thank you. Alderman McFarlane, would you like to speak to it?
The intensification of the area between Bellerive and Howrah is something I think that Council needs to address in the long-term planning of stormwater and sewer. Obviously, sewer is not our problem, but stormwater is. And when we have continual infill coming to Council at a time where we have not got any strategies in place for the intensification of that area, I think it's time we review some of our future plans, but we won't write them up as overlays.
Speakers? Alderman James.
Order for the mover to actually outline his reasons, Mr. Mayor, why he is moving the officer's recommendation, and in fact he's going to exercise his right of reply and therefore try to get a few brownie points, I would submit.
Alderman,
okay, all right.
Would you please?
Okay, yes, I'll come back to the subject matter. I have been to this property. I've actually sat in the backyard and experienced what, in fact, a large building overhanging their property will do to that standard of living. It just defeats the whole purpose of it, and it's a case of bulk, scale, and also the impact on the amenity of the residents at 38 Queen Street. It's interesting to note that in the officer's recommendation on page 108, the comment is that the proposed development meets the relevant, this is the officer's comment, the proposed development meets the relevant tests of the scheme in relation to overshadowing as discussed. Specifically, the overshadowing would not be greater than the existing upon the habitable parts of the neighbouring dwellings to the south at both 38 Queen Street and 5/42 Queen Street, which the scheme considers to be a reasonable impact. This is because, this is the interesting bit, this is because the two existing buildings on the rear part of the subject cast significant shadows at winter solstice. So they've actually identified that these buildings that are there already cast significant shadows on the private open space at 38 Queen Street. And the previous paragraph is saying that this will not make any difference at all. In fact, it seems to me it's going to reduce it or not be as strong or as have much impact. So what are we about here? Do we believe that there is an impact on that property at 38 Queen and also at 5/42 Queen Street? Both of those persons are residents, representatives, have put in their concerns in relation to these buildings. And they are of a size and bulk and scale which is going to impact upon the actual lifestyle of the property owners at number 38 Queen and 5/42. We have to consider, and you have to go there and look at these things. It's very easy to actually just look at a template or at a diagram and say, look, that doesn't impact. You physically have to go, and in the last 25 years, I've always gone to look at these things because you can't appreciate, or you will not appreciate, the extent of people's concerns until you actually go there and look at it and see and listen to what they have to say. They have to live there. We don't live there. We don't live there. They live there, and they are being basically going to be disadvantaged or have their lifestyle basically, downgraded, if that's the word, to the sense of this. The officer's comments are not appropriate. And I've just said, on the one hand, the existing buildings cast the overshadowing, and to a significant extent, and they're saying that how could these other buildings make it worse? Well, that's absolutely ridiculous. It's going to impact, and I will not support this recommendation.
The other speakers, Alderman Chong.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Whilst I do understand the officer's recommendation, like Alderman James, I will not be supporting it, and overshadowing is the reason I won't be supporting it. Like Alderman James, and I'm sure many of us, we've actually gone and visited this property in back and back. Currently, the people who live at number 38 Queen Street can sit in the back garden pretty well any time of day. They might have to move the chair a bit, but there is sunlight in the back garden, even in the middle of the winter solstice. This talks about they will get sunshine after 12 o'clock. Now, if somebody likes enjoying sitting there in the morning, that's a huge change in their lifestyle. And I think that alone means for me that it's very difficult to support this, but that actually does make quite a difference in the change of the amenity of the facility for the people who live there. I find the 3 hours at winter solstice a really difficult time frame to come to terms with. I know that's what's in the scheme and therefore that's what we have to apply. It seems inordinately short for me, and that's obviously what we deal with, but I still think it's inappropriate. Putting that aside, I think that the consideration should be given to the overshadowing here and the change that this particular development will bring about, so I can't support it.
Alderman Turley.
The question, Mr Mayor, is whether what's in the scheme is applied to this development, it's applied to the next development, it's applied, and it is. This test applies to other things that we have evaluated before. So we can't necessarily start saying one condition applies more than the other. If the test is 3 hours at winter solstice, that's what it is. We don't like it, but it has to be changed before we can actually take it away from being a condition. The fact is there were 2 outbuildings, they're being removed and being replaced. The look of the place will improve. There's also reference in the report that some of the overshadowing has been caused not on uninhabitable rooms, but habitable rooms that council doesn't even know are being inhabited because there's no approval for a granny flat. So these are things that we have to actually consider. So I can understand Alderman Scholl not liking that condition, but we have to assess every application based on that condition and not just pick and choose which one we apply it to.
Speakers? Right to reply, Alderman here.
I chose not to make any opening remarks because my reason for moving the motion is that outlined in the officer's recommendation. I didn't have anything to add to that. But I do want to respond to the debate that's happened. I think Alderman Thurley's pretty much said it quite succinctly, is that regardless of what we like or dislike, we have to apply the requirements of the planning scheme. If we have an issue with what that provides for, then that is an issue with the scheme, and we need to go through the process. But as a planning authority, our responsibility is to apply the scheme. Now, I sympathise with people who are being overshadowed, and people do like morning sunlight. It is an amenity issue, and I can understand people, feeling the need for that and appreciating it. But unfortunately, we have a planning scheme that defines unreasonable overshadowing as you will not receive, and it doesn't matter what time of the day it is, you will receive less than 3 hours sunlight during the winter solstice. It's a very clear definition, and as a planning authority, all we can do is apply the scheme. If we don't do our job and apply the scheme as a planning authority, then we just get overturned in the tribunal. So what's the point? So that definition is quite clear. It's quite objective. There's no subjectivity to it. That's our role as a planning authority, is to apply that.
Yes, so the motion before the chair is for approval, subject to conditions and advice. All those in favour? Against? Carried. That concludes our business as a planning authority. Moving on to asset management. 11.5.1 is a recreational needs analysis, moved by Alderman Campbell, seconded by Alderman Chong. Alderman Campbell, would you like to speak to it?
Well, only very briefly, we need to get on with this as quickly as we can. We've got a huge demand in the backlog for recreational needs, and I thoroughly recommend the motion to the council.
I think before we make anything in terms of increased allocation of money to infrastructure, we actually need to do a proper recreational needs analysis. We have so many people use our facilities, but we don't know what their demands are. We really need to look at this properly as a strategic overview.
Alderman McFarlane.
I would like to have
Alderman
included in any kind of recreational needs analysis. Passive recreation has come out during times of consultation with our strategic planning as having a high priority, and so we need to have those recreational needs addressed, both passive and active rec.
The report actually details that this analysis will take 8 to 9 months. Does that mean that we won't actually have considered it before we look at the budget?
Alderman Jones.
Look, when Alderman Chong moved this motion, I believe this is basically what precipitated. I think I'm right in saying that, am I?
Oh, it is referenced in the
It's
report.
referencing it. I think that's it. Look, we were privy at the last workshop to a list of stats which shows and which basically changed my mind, if you want to put it that way, Mr Mayor. And I don't change my mind very often in relation to matters, and I think the General Manager may be nodding there in agreement. But nevertheless, the question that I have, not question, the comment I will make is that the estimates for 17-18 be amended by the 45,000. And when I raised this at Friday's briefing, I used a term that was taken, metaphorically speaking, in my interpretation in relation to that. So this fund, I believe, is a fund that we need to manage very, very carefully, and we have been able to use a number of the funds from this for many important projects within the city. And one of those is this skateboard park over there at Rosden, near the Rosden College. So I'm saying to everybody here that I will support this on the basis that we have a situation where we cannot provide recreational facilities or grounds for the many user groups, not only on this side of the river, but on the other side of the river. Now, having said that, I believe we look after our own first, and that is most important. And if this will lead towards us spending money in relation to the 7 Mile Beach Sports Ground Precinct, which I believe will go a long way to, and perhaps we can do this in a shorter time frame than perhaps in the longer term. And also if we can update or upgrade the Risdon Vale Oval, and I think that may come as a consequence of our $970,000 that we are doing, or obviously the master plan is out for consultation, but for that building that we're going to build in Risdon Vale. And over dinner tonight, I had a discussion with Alderman Peers, and I think his comment was that once we get decent training facilities and change rooms and all those that are part of the requirement for a sporting facility, then we will have and attract other users to Risdon Vale, and also that may be in the shorter term, but in the longer term we can have the 7 Mile Beach. I will be supporting this, but in conclusion, Mr Mayor, I think that we should always be very, very careful when we dip into our unallocated cash, but in this particular circumstance I believe it's appropriate, and I will support the motion.
Thank you, Mayor. As most people know, I'm involved in a lot of sporting clubs and sponsor a lot of sporting clubs, but what I read this is fantastic, and I agree with what Alderman James said then, but our recreational needs are fine, and we do need to look at that as happened in our workshop. We've discussed that. But this report, it just worries me a little. I do not think it's going far enough, because at the moment, the amount of sporting clubs I'm involved with, women's sport is going ahead in leaps and bounds. We know that will continue to grow for some years yet, and I think that's fantastic. Our sporting needs are great, to see our recreational needs, but another thing I'm going to raise, which is not in this report, is also changing facilities for women. Now, I don't think that's a part of this report, but the fact is, at the moment, it's got to be included for anything we do. And maybe the Risdon Vale one's a classic example where we get it right, because I think at some later stage we'll need lights at Risdon Vale, and clubs will certainly come. I didn't realise we were so short of training facilities, which we are, and this report will identify some of that, but I'm just hoping we're allowing the need for women's sport to grow. I notice the football club is increasing. Junior girls teams are just increasing. The only, one of them that's going backwards slightly is touch football. Why, I don't know. The numbers seem to be stagnant. But even women's rugby, women's soccer, just going ahead in leaps and bounds. So I hope we're not just saying, yeah, let's have a look at the overall facilities we need. Let's get the facilities right for men and women change rooms as well.
Alderman Walker.
$45,000 is, even in a council budget the size that we have, a significant quantum of money. But you look at the expenditure we have in the passive and the recreational areas, and the concept of opportunity cost is really quite big in these areas. Everything we choose to advance means that something else potentially might miss out or gets put down the level. And I've got to say that when I first came onto council, I was uncomfortable with the science around how we did it. I really was. It was almost like certainly wasn't an old boys tie, but it was some secret liniment handshake or something as to how certain things seemed to be of higher priority than others I didn't quite understand. It's really important that we understand with these things the perceived and actual needs, and also as we go about this, when we're making expenditure investment, how different recreation is used through the continuum of life, because some activities and some sports are intense but only for a very small period in the life cycle, and there are other activities that just you do even right up through to well past your 90s. So if we get this right, it'll be money well spent.
Thank you. Other speakers? Alderman here.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, one of the things that I'm really interested to see come out of the recreational needs analysis is, because my understanding is what we're looking at is what the demand is for recreation and then to what extent that's supplied. And we can look at that across a number of different demographics, and Alderman Walker referred to age, but I'm also interested in the geographic provision of sporting facilities, because we do tend to be making decisions about building recreational facilities, and that's whether it's active or passive recreation across the city, on what is essentially a bit of an ad hoc basis, and I'm hoping that what we can identify through this process is whether there are particular areas that are underserviced. But I would like to ask you, Mr Mayor, or Mr Graham through you, whether I think a similar exercise in relation to our public open space in identifying those geographic areas of underservicing probably come through our public open space review. So can that information then be fed into this analysis?
Mr Mayor, I have always believed totally in sport and recreation, and what we get back as a community from being involved in sport and rec is immeasurable in terms of health and well-being and community involvement and connectiveness as a society. I commend Mr Graham because I have seen a turnaround, a change of attitude from this council in relation to sport and rec. I have seen such a positive attitude coming from Mr Graham because I worked at council in the sporting area 12 years ago, 13 years ago, 14 years ago, and I was worried about meeting the needs of the sporting requirements for clubs back then. And I used to say to my immediate manager, what is the plan? What is going forward? Are you making allowance? Oh, we don't need to. We'd rather have less ground. That was his comment at the time. But now we have a man in charge who's actually proactive and is planning. So I'm recommending this expenditure of $45,000, a mere amount, to actually get something underway that'll have huge benefits.
I do need to point out that Mr Graham is a diligent public servant working on behalf of the entire council. Are there any other speakers? Right, a reply, Alderman Campbell.
No, I think most of the aldermen have summed it up, that we do have a very important need, and this is a step forward in this matter.
Thank you. The motion before the chair is that we amend the 2017-18 estimates by $45,000 and from unallocated cash, and it requires an absolute majority of council. All those in favour? And carried unanimously. Thank you. 11.7.1 is the Copying Refuse Disposal Site Joint Authority amendment of the rules.
I'll move the rules be, we support the amendment to the rules.
Could I ask for a seconder first, please? Alderman McFarlane. Alderman Campbell.
It is a long and drawn out and complicated process, and it's come about.
I supported, I read all of the changes and I support all of the changes. The topic of discussion on Friday was in relation to Rule 191, which was recommending that the business plan, which is a commercial in confidence document, is not loaded to a web. It's standard business practice not to have business plans open. However, directors, members, stakeholders, shareholders can all access that information by right. So I recommend whoever made all these changes, because on other committees these take up a lot of time and discussion when proper planning should be occurring. So congratulations to whoever rewrote and reviewed this document.
Right, a reply. Put the motion then that the as tabled. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Item 11.7.2 is the annual plan for 2017-18, and the recommendation is that we adopt the plan. Alderman McFarlane, thank you. Second, Alderman Cusick. Alderman McFarlane, would you like to speak to the plan? To the motion, sorry.
I support the motion.
Thank you. Alderman Cusick.
No, so we discussed it significantly. I support the recommendation.
Other speakers? Motion then is that we adopt the plan. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Item 12 is Alderman's question time, and no matters on notice. Questions without notice. Alderman von Berger. Alderman Pears. Alderman Doust.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question in opposition.
Noted. Thank you. Alderman Cusick.
Mr. Paul or yourself, Smith, at the and neither of you here, I don't believe, at the last council meeting, there were questions made by a member of the public asking something like, I'm paraphrasing, would the council undertake not to advertise development applications over the Christmas period? Can you tell me whether that question has been answered for the person?
Previously, I'm aware the question's been asked. I'm not aware whether it's been answered or not, so I will follow that tomorrow.
My question is then, what would be the ramifications if council received a development application, say the 18th of December, for instance, did nothing in relation to this till, say, 7th of January, and advertised first time on that day, I think it's about 20 days. Firstly, as I understand, the council can't refuse a development application when submitted, given all the boxes are ticked. Does the DA lapse if the council does not deal with it, or within the time frame?
Previously, the DA doesn't lapse. If we don't deal with it within the prescribed period of how many days, 42 days, it's in effect a deemed approval and would go to the Planning and Appeals Tribunal. So we're obliged to advertise applications when we receive them, when we receive a complying application, because we have a defined time period within which we have to deal with it. Otherwise, it de facto runs the risk of becoming a deemed approval.
So that would have been the case in relation to, say, Kangaroo Bay?
Yes.
Alderman Hume. Alderman Chong.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In one of the weekly briefing reports, there was in one of the weekly briefing reports, there was a report on the traffic congestion study that's been done and a memorandum of understanding that was signed. And I noted in there was some talk about incentives for public transport. Did we manage to get ferries included in the public transport, or is it still only buses?
Mr. Graham, are you in a position to answer?
Yeah.
Alderman McFarlane.
We have a problem in our community on their comprehension and understanding of the new planning scheme. So, looking forward to consultation with the peer and the consultation process, I wonder if we can start to produce information sheets relevant to different topics and load them to the web so that the community can comprehend and take their time, not just come to a meeting.
So the question is, can
we produce information sheets on planning issues that the community can relate to? And my example I was going to give is...
look, I think it's worth pursuing.
Yeah.
Maybe we could expand on that at a workshop.
My answer to that briefly is yes, we can, but I would propose that we don't do it until the new Tasmania planning scheme comes into effect, probably sometime in the next 6 months, because we're going to be giving out we're going to be producing information sheets about something at the moment that potentially only has a lifespan of another 6 months. And I think to do that and then provide information sheets in respect of the new planning scheme from maybe February or March next year would be somewhat confusing and onerous.
I might agree to that, except for the current circumstances where...
this is not an opportunity for debate.
Well, I don't think that we should. I think we should
start with Alderman McFarlane, this is question time.
Okay, it's question time.
You've raised a question which is a very good question.
And
I think we should pursue it.
Is in the context of an issue that came up tonight where we're talking about compliance and performance criteria, if we could have an update and review of our comprehension skills on the wording of reports so that we can understand when legislation doesn't necessarily need to apply if, for instance, building envelopes are not a relevant factor within the consideration, then maybe the report could actually state that.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, I'll put that answer that in the reverse, in the sense that where building envelopes do apply, that will be flagged in the report. So therefore, if it's not flagged in the report, the inference is that there are no building zones or sites that need to be referenced in respect to that matter. So if it's not referenced in the report, you can take it that there is no building. What's the word? Building zone? Envelope, thank you, that applies to that development law.
Alderman Thurley. Alderman Walker.
Yes, Mr. Mayor. Casting back to the council meeting, it is a while back, the 17th of March 2014, when we considered what we were going to do around a boat ramp in a part of Lauderdale. The decision was made that we would move ahead by putting in a DDA ramp access, and the point, I'm getting to the point of my question, which is, among the many things that were made part of that report was point 8, any other unique issues. Point 8 stated that, and this is on page 253 I think, Any access ramp must be wide enough to allow for the carrying of small watercraft and also meet the requirements of the disability access standards. Mr Mayor, to whoever you think's most appropriate, do we believe that we have met point 8 appropriately?
Mr Graham, are you in a position?
Certainly at the time we thought we might be one was another means of providing easier access for trolley around.
Follow up, one of my questions is related to what Alderman Walker just put to Mr Graham, and that is, Mr Graham, through you to Mr Graham. Mr Graham, you mentioned at the workshop last week that you're going to circulate to Alderman the recommendations of the TCAP, in particular the recommendation in the TCAP proposal which specifically referred to, amongst other things, the work that's been done at the head of the canal at Lauderdale. Can we expect that before you go on leave on Thursday? That's the first question.
Mr Mayor, that has been provided by Mr Graham to my office to circulate. I only got it today, so it's circulated in the next sometime this week.
Thanks very much, Mr General Manager. I just wanted to make sure before Mr Graham goes on leave, and I might add it, well-earned leave. The second question is, I had a call today from a gentleman at Lauderdale who has suggested that following the excellent work that's been done by Council with regards to the footpath program in Lauderdale, there is a problem with twitch grass, and it's a pity to see the good work that's been done by Council be basically upset, or obviously by the twitch grass. Is it possible for Council to have done on an annual basis spray of the twitch grass within the Lauderdale area as part of the process of keeping under control this rampant weed and obviously maintaining our assets to a longer period of time, other than what twitch grass can actually do to
Manager's definitely very twitchy here.
Mr Mayor, I concern that Alderman James has that question in writing. I'm quite happy to take it and investigate the matter and respond. I personally have no idea what twitch grass is.
Take it along. Can you understand by writing? All right, thanks Alderman James. That concludes the open session, Council. Could I thank members of the public that have enjoyed the full meeting today? We do need to go into committee there. Could I have a motion, please? Alderman Chong, Alderman Pearce. All those in favour? Carried unanimously.